Welcome back, guys. Okay, so another exciting day of the Twits. Let's see what chapters we're going to be reading today. So today we are on chapters 7 and 8. So we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we're doing this one's chapter 7. And chapter 8, bit of a funny 8. So we're doing Wormy Spaghetti and the funny walking stick today. So let's get started. Are you ready for today's chapters? Okay. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried them back into the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock she cooked spaghetti for lunch. She mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plates. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful of her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoving them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, taking a mouthful. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating the worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctive bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." So Mrs. Twit is getting her own back now. Ooh, I wonder if Mr. Twit will discover he's actually eaten worms. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful, and then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of a tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it was a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it's worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor, rocking with horrible laughter. So Mrs. Twit has now got her own back on Mr. Twit, but do you think it ends there? No, I think it's going to carry on. And as we can see from the next picture here, look at Mr. Twit's face. He looks like a big trickster, doesn't he? So let's read this chapter. It's called The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. He then stuck a tiny little round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. Now, why do you think he's done that? If you look at the picture, you can see all the little tiny, like penny-like pieces of wooden stick to go on the end. Why do you think he's doing that? What will happen to the stick if you keep sticking tiny little round pieces of wood on? It'll get longer, won't it? So, do you think she'll notice? Let's see what she thinks is going to happen. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice. The following night Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it so neatly that the extra bit looked like part of the stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, you're growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual. She didn't even notice how long it was getting when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at her stick. "I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring back at her walking stick. "It must have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on the earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're a shrinking woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." So he's actually made Mrs. Twit believe that she is shrinking. Ooh, that's a dastardly plan, isn't it? But actually quite clever at the same time. Let's see what happens on the next page. "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat. See how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, and that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. That was the end of that chapter, Mrs. Twit and about the walking stick. So what do you think is going to happen next? So we have had Mr. Twit sticking little pieces of wood on the end of her walking stick, and she believes that she is maybe starting to shrink. Mr. Twit is trying to convince her that she's definitely shrinking. So what do you think is going to happen in the next chapter? Do you think she's going to believe Mr. Twit that she's shrinking, or do you think she's going to realise and twig that actually no, she can't shrink, that it's Mr. Twit playing a trick on her? Tricky one. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to read 3 chapters. We're going to read 9, 10 and 11. So I'm sure we'll find the answer out tomorrow, and maybe tomorrow there might be some more dastardly tricks happen. Bye for now and see you tomorrow.